Hi there, my name is Hugo. I'm the CEO and co-founder at The Owl Solutions, and we're so excited to be here today, joined by George Firican. Hi George, how are you doing?
Hi Hugo. Good, it's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for being with us. And Miguel, hi Miguel.
Hi Hugo, how are you?
Doing great, doing great. So we're excited to be here today, all of us, basically to discuss a few topics that we believe that are super important in the market and that are really driving a lot of attention from supply chain professionals today, which is everything around data management and everything around data analytics. And now one of the key questions that we would like to sort of start with and bring to the table is, so why companies fail when adopting supply chain analytics? So we're going to discuss about the role of data governance when it comes to running modern supply chains today. So let's start with a quick introduction. So George, please introduce yourself and Lights on Data, your company.
Thank you. So I'm George Firican. I'm the founder of Lights on Data. And as the name might inform you, I like to put the lights on data. But really, I'm a data governance expert, and I've been working in data management for more than 12 years now, and it's really one of my passions. So I try and bring that knowledge back to the audience and whoever wants to listen and learn more and become a better data professional.
And you have become a real influencer in the market, George. For the ones who follow you and in social media around data management, data governance, you're really becoming an authority in this topic for sure.
Well, I don't know about that, but I appreciate anybody that wants to listen in and learn more.
That's awesome, Miguel.
Hi everyone, my name is Miguel Gallardo. I'm the product director at The Owl Solutions. Most of my experience is in supply chain. I have worked in multiple roles across multiple verticals and organizations, especially in demand planning, supply planning, and implementation of sales and operation planning. But in the last couple of years, I have worked running software implementations and data analytics projects with customers here at The Owl Solutions. And then one of the things that we experience often is the importance of data governance to have successful projects. And this topic is becoming hot and more popular across our customers. And this is the reason we really believe that we would like to explain what is the importance of this type of domains and expertise and how supply chain professionals could take advantage of.
That's great, Miguel. So let's start discussing and sort of sharing some ideas and some stories with our folks there. So I'd say that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what we're seeing as trends in the market over the last probably 20 years, and it's accelerating as more companies are acquiring more and more data nowadays. So many companies we believe that are probably missing, which is probably the biggest opportunity in modern times, which is really taking advantage of what we call the data revolution, right? So the data revolution with companies acquiring and spending so much money in tools that allow them to collect or create new data sets within the organization. But the issue is becoming that in the past, maybe 20 years ago, companies didn't really have a lot of access to information and data. Now, what has happened, I think, is like a pendulum effect, where now we're going to a direction where companies are having abundant data, right? So we went from a place where data was relatively scarce for many organizations, and now we're in a place where more and more every single day we have access to more and more data. And now that's creating a different type of challenges, which is how can we leverage that information and that data to turn it into something that is valuable for the organization. Now, the contradiction to me, at least, and I don't know what you guys think about it, but some of the contradiction to me is that although companies have spent significant money and investment in data collection tools or software that allows them to again create data or collect data, so probably 80 to 90% of companies still rely on spreadsheets when it comes to analysis, reporting. So why is that happening? What are your thoughts about that? What are the things that are really creating some challenges for organizations to capitalize on this big opportunity around data?
To me, from what I'm seeing, is the fact that companies are investing in all these technologies, which, mind you, they're great technologies, but they're not investing in the best practices on how to use them, and also how they should all work in that ecosystem, because more often it's just a one software, one database that they're storing things in. And as things unravel and it's kind of the wild, wild west, everybody's using it the way they think it's best to use them. In the end, you end up with a lot of nonsense that is not really working for the company or for that unit or for that individual. So then, people want to be a bit proactive and action oriented, and they want to take it into their own hands. So they go to what they are mostly familiar with, and that's the spreadsheet. Very familiar, easy to use. And they start storing their own information that way. Or, they export it from all these systems because maybe they work easier. They then amend it with other information or other data from other sources because they feel they have to wait in a queue to get that information otherwise. So they're kind of trying to take charge, and thinking they're doing what they think it's best. But in the end, they're creating a lot of inefficiencies.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think I like one of the things that you mentioned around, the potential confusion, right? That, the current environment could create for organizations. And I think we went from a place where, as I mentioned before, probably we didn't have a lot of data available at our fingertips in the past. Now we got more data, but that, the abundance of that data is creating confusion if we don't really use it around with the best practices, and we also package it with other concepts like that are really super relevant, and that especially is important in the supply chain field. Miguel, if you can sort of share with us some ideas around why in the supply chain field you believe that this situation of abundant data is creating even more challenges.
Yeah, I think, that topic of, as George was describing, having multiple applications is a complicated topic in supply chain. Supply chains are complex systems. And when we talk about supply chains, we need to remind ourselves that they are multiple topics and domains. Supply chain composed procurement, warehouse management, inventory management, the distribution systems, the planning system. And then, as George was mentioning, normally each one of these functions could have their own applications, and they share perspectives, they share view, but they are managed in isolation. And then when we think of supply chain as a complex system as a whole, but they are managed in isolation for each department, that create an additional layer for supply chain in terms of complexity, in terms of how hard is coordinate all of these efforts. And then what you mentioned, George, about the standalone application, in the case of supply chain system, you have, for example, your core, your enterprise resource planning systems. And then what you do is you implement a warehouse management system, a demand planning system, an inventory management system, a manufacturing execution system, a supplier relationship and collaboration system. And each one of these systems, to have, they have their own databases, their own integration process of the data, and sometimes because they don't implement the best practice, they try to solve a lot of the lack of governance of how they manage the data with the integrations. And then at the end, when you are not able to coordinate your data, the fastest option in the short term is download your data, as George was mentioning, put it in Excel, and try to do the corrections or the manage of the alignment between them outside of the system, because you have many systems. And then I think that specific topic of multiple systems, it affects specifically supply chain, because supply chain is a broader topic. It's not like, we have only one activity that we are doing. As I say, we have procurement, warehouse distribution, production, and even now, with the introduction of e-commerce, and you have more system coming to the complexity of the organization. That, of course, is coordinating. The coordination of them is probably the main challenge that we are reviewing in the supply chain topics. Then, when we want to take advantage of all this data, it gets complicated. Develop supply chain analytics project or advancing forecasting models. How do we know which system have the true data or the relevant data for a specific problem is where the governance, of the data that we are creating as an organization is extremely important.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with that. I think that's a great description, Miguel, because I think in a summary, I think you mentioned three key aspects, right? So you said the domain itself, supply chain, is complex, right? So it's broad and complex. So it covers many aspects of the organization of any business, any manufacturing or distribution business. So it's broad and complex. Number two, so data flows across the organization, and here's I'm gonna use an analogy. This is like a kitchen that has many cookers, right? Where many people is sort of touching, the data across the organization. So that of course creates also potential confusion and potential
sometimes
issues.
even from outside of the organization too.
Exactly. Outside of suppliers, customers. So therefore it's very broad, complex, and many people, many stakeholders interacting with data. You also said around disparity of systems. So systems are disparate, and companies, as I mentioned at the very beginning, have been investing in more transactional systems to complement some of the shortfalls of ERP or legacy systems, and therefore we are in a scenario nowadays where what I call the proliferation of applications in the supply chain field, where you have multiple systems that are not necessarily integrated, and that of course creates also a challenge when it comes to data. That's creating potentially data islands across the organization. Have you heard about the term data silos or data islands? That's happening, right? And unfortunately, that's of course adding more and more complexity to the supply chain domain specifically, right? Now, one of the things that I would love to talk a little bit more is around even definitions about data. So what data is, and actually even the different types of data. And I think that's also a topic that creates confusion in people. Sometimes people think about data like under a one single definition, but there's multiple ways to classify and categorize the type of data that you have in an organization. Let's talk a little bit about that, because that also creates, as I said, confusion within organizations, and confusion leads to probably not making the right decision, right? So let's talk about the different types of data within an organization. What are those types of data that you guys observe within any organization in general?
There's different ways of looking at that, structured versus structured, and big and small and all that stuff. But I think the most common categories would be the master data, reference data, transactional data, and Miguel, you were mentioning analytical data.
Yeah, and I think, in the case of the supply chain, in the old days, we manage everything by paper, And then I think we need to, when we classify our data, we need to understand what that paper will become today, And then when we want to deliver a product, we have an order, a physical order. And today that data exists in a system. And how that data is classified in the ways that we give governance, I think is extremely important. I think for a supply chain professional that want to take advantage of all the data opportunity, we need to understand, I think, the main difference between master data, and the golden record, as we want to, as it's called normally, and the transactional data that they have in the system. That is normally what they do on a daily basis. We need to deliver products, we need to receive materials, we need to storage inventory, and that before, as I say, was done in papers or physical things, and now it's done in data. And when we have problem with the paper, we could review it, validate that all the data was correct. But today, when we have it in a system, we are not checking sometimes that all that data or that transactional data that we have in the system have the proper values, that. And I think, George, if you could talk a little bit more, between master data specifically and transactional data, because I think the transactional data is where we are seeing more problems in the supply chain today, because when we move from paper to have the data in the systems now, we are not doing the same level of validation. If something is wrong because I put a wrong address or a wrong data in a paper and the product gets shipped to a different location, we know because it was there, it was physically in the products. But when that data gets in a system and doesn't get printed, we are not sure if we have the proper data inside. And then I think, George, if you could help people that they are listening and watching this video, like understand this difference, I think that is one of the main opportunities for supply chain professionals to understand these two different classifications.
Yeah, so to me, that transaction data is describing, again, something that comes out of a transaction, right? So like a financial transaction, you place an order, you have an invoice, there's a payment, there's a delivery. We're talking about logistics, the travel records and papers for that. So it's something that, it's you register for an event, you sign up for an event. There's again, a transaction is taking place. But between what? Well, between that master data usually. So master data gives you that information about the business entities that kind of provide a context for that transaction. So things like a customer and a supplier. So there's a transaction that happens between those two, right? Otherwise, neither of them would make sense to exist. There's other types of master data. Most common one, again, so the customer, the supplier, vendor, then anything that has to do with location as well. Maybe party, legal. There's a few items, products, exactly.
Yeah, and I think, having clear understanding of, as you mentioned, the master data is what provide meaning or context to your transactional data. It's an order is delivered from a vendor, for example. The vendor provides or ship the product to you, or you need to, move inventory from one warehouse. That your warehouse is your master data, and you move product from one location to another. I think understanding that, and we need to, provide governance for both of them. But I think having clear distinction between, there is something that need to be well defined as your master data, and what we have experienced with our customers, organizations are realizing the importance to have governance of master data, and we are seeing more organizations having data governance program related. I need to have my items, entered in the system, or my vendor address need to be good that I could receive the products, or my customer, delivery address need to be good. Otherwise, the product, will not be, delivered to the proper location. And I think organizations are realizing the importance of master data, and most of the customers that we work with, they have an emerging efforts to try to document this. But in the transactional side, sometimes, we don't see the same, the level of documentations or effort to understand how this flows, and I think, both of them, they are important, but at least what we have experienced is that we see emerging effort in the master, data aspect but in the transactional data, sometimes, if we ask a customer, do you have documented the fields that you complete in a purchase order? They don't have it, or which fields need to be, they are mandatory compared with the one that they are optional. And then when we review the quality of the data later, we see this disparity, and that is one of the main explanations why we are seeing that they don't trust the data at the end. And I think that is the main problem. When we don't document this transactional data or how the information gets completed, you don't trust the information that you could extract from this data, and when you want to implement a key performance indicator or a metric or identify improvement opportunities from this transactional data, because they don't have the proper governance. I think people they have doubts about what is the possible value that they could extract from this.
So that's a good takeaway, Miguel. So in terms of that, probably companies more and more are understanding that data is an asset, right? Of course, I guess there's still a long way to get to a place where it's really treated as an asset effectively. Let me provide you with one example. So if you talk to a manufacturing company, probably you as a company are going to have an extensive number of assets within your organization. Thinking about physical assets, you're going to have your manufacturing facilities. You're going to have your inventory is an asset, so it's part of your balance sheet as part of your financials. So you have to report it on a monthly basis, either to a board or to the CEO of the company or to your shareholders, etc. So you have to be accountable for how that physical asset performs. Is the utilization of your manufacturing facility, your asset, good enough? Is the performance of your inventory turnover, right, doing well? So there's a lot of focus on physical assets in organizations. Now, we're not there yet, and not sure how far we're from a point where in the future, probably, why not, we're going to start seeing now in the balance sheet of the organization now data as part of those assets too. That would be a really probably a point where it's going to change the dynamic of the discussion, because when that happens, when data now has a financial value for the organization, it gets inputted in the balance sheet or in any financial statement, now you're going to have people feeling the pain for being really accountable for driving better utilization of your data, or driving better quality of your data, or driving better results or business value out of your data. That could be a really tipping point for changing the discussion between, we're going to try to maximize the use of the data, and now we're forced to do it simply because there's internal or external forces that are driving more interest around treating data as an actual asset for the organization. Now, to your point regarding the distinction between master data and transactional data. So let's talk a little bit more about a couple of examples about lack of governance when it comes to transactional data. So do you have any example you could share with us, such as, I don't know, things like you have experience with some of the customers?
Yeah, I will provide an example, of course, without a name, but sometimes especially with all the data governance work that you could do, sometimes the impact, you don't see it in the governance itself. You see in when you use the data. For example, if you use the data to create something, to track value, you see it for that type of motivation. And then one example that, we saw once is something as basic as how you generate a purchase order. When you create a purchase order, you need to complete the order, the day that you put the PO, the day that the customer wanted, which products are within the PO, the prices, and you have basic information that you need to do when you complete a PO. Normally, that information is not defined. Some people, and what happened with transactional data, people believe that the meanings are, obvious. When you read it and you see, the meaning is this, and that I would say is the most common failure, that they believe that the fields are self-explanatory. And then, for me at least, I don't know what you will say, George, but if it's not written, it is not documented. Documentation is written. If you don't have a document that say this is the meaning, this is the description, this is the definition, doesn't exist. There is no governance without written rules. And then
absolutely. Otherwise, there's a lot of assumptions being made.
And exactly. And then I will provide an example that with a field that was straightforward. That is, every time that you create a document, for example, a purchase order, they have a creation date, and sometimes it's called order date or creation date, depending on the system. And I would say that people could believe that this is the most straightforward fields from all the document. All the other probably you need to define it more, but the creation date is something that is by default by any transaction. And one thing that happened is we implement measurements about responsiveness and reliability of the procurement process. We want to measure how long does it take to, for the vendors to deliver a product. Are they doing it on time or not? And one of the metrics that we implement to to do a continuous improvement program was we want to measure the lead time of the vendors. How long does it take for a vendor from the day that we put the order until the day that they deliver? And this company put a target on them. The lead time should be something close to the target value that they have uploaded in the system. And one of the things that happened when we start to audit the data is that we start to see order dates, the creation date in the future. Imagine today is, March, and we started to see orders if we were to the system today, the order date was April the 1st, April the 2nd. And we said, what? And then what happened is there was no restriction to modify that date in the system. And then because people were, measured in terms of lead times, to achieve the lead time, they start to put the order in the future that when you calculate the lead time looks shorter. Because, there was no assumption. Everyone assumed, I could modify it. It wasn't written. It wasn't explicit what was the meaning of that field. And also it wasn't documented how you use it, for which type of calculation you use it. And then sometimes when this type of example happens, people don't understand where this information is consumed later. Do you use it for some KPIs? And people believe that a small modification doesn't have an impact in company results. And then I think, there was a movie like the butterfly effect, when people, you could modify a small piece of data. You are doing a clerical work entering that information. It could have a huge impact in a performance KPI that you are doing, or even legal things, within that company. And I think that is a clear example why governance is important, and governance is written. And as you say, we are seeing more efforts in the supply chain domain to document the entities, the warehouse, the product, the vendors. But with the transactional data, because people believe that they are self-explanatory, they don't define them. They don't define what is the information that we need to be completing when we do a purchase order. And also, it's not about only the definitions. It's also important who owns it. Who will be completing this information. I think, and then George, I think you could talk more about the roles and responsibilities. When we are completing data, because one thing is what data we are completing, and the definitions, but also who, and because supply chains is the interaction between multiple departments, that is another area where, you could have confusion. Oh, this data is not mine. We have seen that a lot as well. And then, George, I think if you could talk a little bit more about roles and responsibilities related to data governance, I think that would be great as well.
Yeah, I just want to give you a funny example first when we talk about data. And is this company that opened another office. One was in North America, the other one was, I think, in Eastern Europe somewhere. But what happened is when they were entering all these dates for purchases and different transactions, they were following instructions. They had the definitions, the order creation date and everything was clear. It was defined. It was governed. But they didn't have a standard for it. That wasn't clarified. So in North America versus Europe and most of the world too, the month and the date, they switch around. So the order is different. And because they launched this new office, I think it was beginning of the year, they actually went for about 6 months. They realized, okay, well, somebody's putting all these orders in the future because they were, using the same system, same database, but they were switching the date and the month. So
that's a great example. Standards. That's a great example, George, and is kind of going in the direction of what I called having good data parenting, right? So, and that means for me, it's like, you are responsible for creating that data record, but not only creating the data record, but also babysitting, hopefully, the data record until it gets mature. And I think managing data across the different life cycles of the organization is critical. And that requires, of course, definition of ownership, who owns the data, definition of who maintains the data as well, because especially in this field of supply chain, part of the difficulties is that, as I mentioned before, so data touches many hands, or many hands touch a same data record, following the example of Miguel about the purchase order. So who creates typically a purchase order is a buyer in a procurement or sourcing department, but who, for instance, finishes or closes the cycle of that purchase order, for instance, when the material gets received in a warehouse. And sometimes the person closing the cycle of that purchase order is not necessarily the same buyer, but it's a person now working in logistics. So therefore, that person now is going to get into that same purchase order and is going to update a field that it states, the date where, the product was physically delivered into that warehouse. So therefore, there's many cookers in that kitchen, right? The data kitchen. But at the end of the day, as long as the rules of the game are clear, it shouldn't be a problem. But unfortunately, I think we see that a lot of those rules around transactions and all of those rules around, even master data are still unclear, and that creates, confusion on the one hand, and on the other hand, when you want to really evolve your organization to take advantage of this big data opportunity, right, you are constrained. And now you start realizing that there's issues in your foundation. Your foundational work is weak, it's not strong, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, one more comment I think also that is applicable to the supply chain. Normally, when you study supply chain, the basic course tell you that supply chains is three flows. The flow of physical goods, the flow of the information, and the flow of the money. And I think we are talking about data governance, but we don't need to forget that data is the representation of a physical flow. And sometimes, we need to also understand the physical flow of things to make sense of what we have in the data. Something that could look really strange, or you could say why they are doing this. Sometimes when people who come from outside, you cannot understand why they do a decision that it totally doesn't make sense. But when you flow things in the physical things as well, it could create you have an explanation. I'm not saying that you should be doing that, but at least you could put some context at why people behave in that way. One example that we found is regarding dates as well. Like this was sales orders that need to be delivered to customers. They weren't completing the delivery date in the place that the ERP had for. It was blank. But they have a text note that in the top of the invoice, in the sales order, they put the date as a text in the order. And the field was there, like the placeholder for the data was there, but they didn't put it there. They put it as a text in the order, in the header of the butcher. And then customer service department didn't know. They didn't have an answer. And then we did a walkthrough. We follow an order from the point and they put it in the system until the time that leave the warehouse. And what we found is that that specific field that captured the delivery date didn't print in the physical order or in the warehouse management system. Like you have the ERP, but in the system and in the physical order. And then they were in the transition. They were physically reviewing the order. It was an old school customer. The picker take the order, and because that field didn't print in the physical one, nobody, even if you put the information there, people couldn't read and then do the picking. And then the reason they put it physically in the order, it was that then the picker, when they select the specific order and they didn't do the picking process, they could read it, and then there was no alignment between the new system that they were implementing and the old system. That information didn't flow. Nobody analyzed which data you need to do the picking process when they implement those systems, and that is the reason they put it physically there. And then, as I say, not that people should be doing that, but sometimes it has an explanation, and that explanation most of the time is connected with physical flows. And then data is a representation of reality. And I think, especially for supply chain professionals, we don't need to forget that all the data that we have in our system represent processes, and then sometimes we need to change our physical process that we could improve our data. And I think that is another important recommendation that I would give to supply chain professionals, that they care about the data, that how we could take more values. We need to understand not only the data aspect, also the physical flow of things.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because and that makes me think that maybe we as human beings, of course, we are visual people in general, so therefore maybe we pay more attention to the physical supply chain rather than the data supply chain, right? The supply chain of data, because at the end, if you think about it, so an organization, if you think about data, at the end you're doing kind of the same physical flow, but when you put it in the context of data, when you're creating data or you're engaging with suppliers to collect some data from them, you're sourcing, right? You're sourcing data, then you are transforming that data into something, right? And then you're probably delivering that data into a person that's consuming that information to make a decision. That's exactly same logic that a physical supply chain follows, because if you're a manufacturer, you're sourcing ingredients to produce an output, right? To produce a product, which, sort of leads me to believe that maybe historically we have been more focused as supply chain professionals to hopefully execute more carefully on the physical supply chain, rather than taking care of also, the data supply chain, the supply chain of data across the enterprise and across multiple enterprises, right?
Yeah, you're totally right regarding, like we take care most of when we have something to lose, like in the case if we don't deliver a product, like somebody will complain for sure. If a data element or record is missing, the impact is not as direct as the ones that you have in your physical supply chain flow. And I think making sure that we utilize our data is a good way that people start to take care of the information that they are the data that they are putting on the system, and my recommendation, how we take care in the same way that we manage our physical supply chain, how we could do effort to improve our data supply chains or the data that we create is start to use it. Most of the problem appears when you want to use your data. If you don't use it, if you don't have KPIs of the data that you are creating, or if you don't measure data quality, you will not be aware. And as always, people say, what doesn't get measured doesn't get improved. Same happens with data, And then my recommendation, even though the data is not clean, I would say start efforts to use it, implement KPIs, or start to measure data quality, assess the completeness of the field. Even though the effort is not perfect, it will help you to identify the improvements opportunity. If you don't use your data, it's really complicated to see what will be the benefit, because it's a lot of effort. George could talk more about, the efforts to do the governance, but it takes a lot of effort. If you don't see the benefit or the impact that it could create, it is difficult to maintain that effort in the future. And then my recommendation would be start to use it, start to use your data. I would say, as I say, sometimes there are a lot of things that they are trendy in terms of like big data analytics, machine learning, deep learning, that they are extremely important and could provide a lot of value in the organization. But sometimes starting with baby steps, or let's define a KPI that is important for the organization that we don't measure today, that use relevant data, it could give you a huge improvement opportunity and also help you to understand your data. What are the limitations? You will see, my KPI looks weird. Why? And then you will do the root cause analysis and you will see there is information that you are not completing. There is data that is missing, or there is data that need to be better, that need to have definition, need to have governance. And coming back with the point that we mentioned it before, when we see the results of what the data could give us, we could improve the data quality or how the is entering the system.
Absolutely. And I think, I like your advice to start small, because it just makes everything more manageable. Otherwise, when you're looking at the whole list of challenges that you need to tackle, you become overwhelmed and you don't start at all. Plus, it also helps build that momentum. You're getting more champions on board, you're getting more support, and of course, leadership support and hopefully funding as well to keep on going and invest in better managing that data and using it.
That's excellent. No, those are great pieces of advice for everyone in the supply chain field. interested to leverage the data more effectively and start with setting that right data foundation, right? And it's a step-by-step process, as George and Miguel pointed out. So we would like to sort of announce that we're gonna be giving a free giveaway at the end of this session for whoever wants to download a free template that we're going to be providing to our audience with data standards for defining relevant fields to manage and maintain a purchase order. So we have spoken a few times already about a few examples around how purchase orders and transactional data around the purchase order creates challenges within organizations. Well, we're going to provide an opportunity for whoever is interested to see for ways to improve the quality and completeness of that process. And so we're going to be providing the possibility for you to download a template with those data standards and tips on how to get better on managing that purchase order information, transactional information. So we're gonna then release some instructions on how to download the template and a link to get there. But that's an opportunity for you to get some practical and concrete support in your journey to improve supply chain data management.
Yeah, and I think that is for all the supply chain professionals that could be watching this video. It's a good procurement is a good place to start. I would say the journey of creating data analytics in supply chain, because sometimes it's a process that we measure only the financial impact. We track what we spend, how much we spend, are we increasing price? But the supply chain dimensions, especially, the reliability, are my suppliers delivering the promise that they gave to me? Or how long it's taking to suppliers to deliver the product to me? These are two attributes that normally APICs through the SCORE model recommend. Reliability, are they delivering the promise, and the responsiveness, how fast they are delivering this. All of these KPIs, most of the data came from the purchase order. And then if you have well-defined, data for your purchase order, it enables you to create these KPIs to measure the reliability and the responsiveness of your procurement process, expanding the areas that you measure, not only focusing in the money or on the spend, also focusing in information that have relevant impact. If a supplier is late, your manufacturing schedule plan will be affected. If the supplier is taking longer lead time, you could replace it for one that will have a shorter lead time. And I think you cannot have this reconfiguration of your supply chain if you are not measuring this aspect. And then I think it's a good template, the one that you are giving away for free, Hugo, to start the journey to create analytics for companies.
Great, that's awesome. And the other announcement that we would like to make today is for that we're super excited because we're gonna be partnering with Lights on Data. So All Solutions and Lights on Data. We're gonna be partnering on working on I would say a tough task, because it's not an easy task, by the way, just to help professionals, supply chain professionals out there to have access to a framework that is going to help those professionals to manage supply chain data more effectively, with some concrete tips and recommendations on how to set up that supply chain data management strategy and program in order to create that framework that helps the supply chain data in the organizations to flow more effectively and add more business value. And that's something that, again, is going to be an ongoing effort. And we're going to be working on it, and we're going to be at the same time providing some value to our audience and our customers in the future. So excited to partner with you, George, on that.
I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a value creation framework.
Fantastic. So at the end of this meeting, I would like to sort of share with you a few questions that we have received from people in the supply chain field, companies that we work with, and industry experts and people that is always sort of approaching us with questions about certain things. So we summarize it in three questions that we would like to sort of bring to the table and hopefully help with providing some insights to those questions. So the first question is about where to start with data management in supply chain. So where to start? What would be that nugget that we would like to share with people? So because this may sound very complex, but it may sound like as you, George, mentioned before, it could sound like an overwhelming task if you want to solve all your data management issues in one day. How to start and where to start?
I will take that one first. I will say it's a combination of factors. It also depends how many resources you have. Of course, like if you have a dedicated team could help you with data management, or you are starting this journey. But I will say you need to start with a problem that is relevant for you. Because the organization need to see the value of it, and if you start with a problem that could be extremely important but is disconnected with the organization priorities, as George mentioned it before, you need to build momentum, you need to build success, that you could bring more resources to your data governance program later in the future. And then relevance within your organization, and nobody knows your organization better than you, but the relevance is extremely important. The second part, it needs to be achievable in a reasonable time frame. There are problems that they are extremely important, but they could be too complex to start with, and then something that is achievable, that you could see the results in a period of time that is, if imagine you start a project and it takes you 2 years to deliver the results, I don't know if the organization will wait for you that long time. And I think, identify a problem that could be a quick win. I'm not saying that you need to start with only quick wins, but something that help you to present the result to the rest of the people. And then having a champion, I would say, is the third one, someone at the higher level of the organization, because this requires effort from multiple departments, coordinations. And then if you don't have a champion that is at, vice president level or C level, that make the organization realize that they will need to do some effort to perceive the value of this and probably change the way that they are working. If, for example, an analyst asks a manager to do something different, people in supply chain are extremely busy. People that we have worked in the domain, we are always running, always late. Everything is urgent. And then imagine you tell me that I need to care about the data on top of all the challenges, that we have. I think, nobody have the time to do it. But we need to start to find a way to slowly bring this to our daily practice. And then that message need to come from as high as possible. Having the champion, I would say these are the 3 factors that I would recommend. And then start purpose, relevant for you, start small, and having the champion, I would say it's the 3 advices for any data governance program that you would like to start. I don't know if you have something else, George.
Well, just to add that different organizations might be at different levels in this journey, and some might be more advanced than others. So some might already have a champion in place, and that's great. So I think maybe one thing to look at first is to better understand your as-is situation, and then see where should you want to go to, and what are those then steps that you need to take. And you've listed some of those, which were brilliant, but it can really differ from one organization to another. There's not a cookie cutter solution that works the best for everybody, and you have to take into account the resources that you have, the strategy, the business goals that you're trying to achieve. What are those drivers, internal and external, and how fast can you get there, of course.
That's great advice, and I think that you have nailed it in terms of many aspects there. So I think identifying that use case and understanding the as is, right? So what's your current state of maturity? Getting support, right? Executive support. This is a this is a transformation for many companies, right? It's hard to go through a transformation to start incorporating elements of data governance, data management in the field of supply chain without really being convinced, equipped with resources, and also with the seeing the opportunity to achieve concrete results in a reasonable time frame. so you can actually implement some of those actions and actually drive better results for your supply chain and make your life better and easier, right? Because that's what we're trying to achieve as well. So make the life of the supply chain professional better, easier, and more effective and more engaged in how to improve the performance of the overall organization. So that's excellent. So the second question is, which is, by the way, that usual question that we receive from people, trying to get some clarification around the role of data, the role of supply chain data management in supply chain is, what's the difference between data management and data governance?
So let's dissect this a little bit. So we keep hearing about being data-driven, value-driven. We want to be a data-driven organization. We want to have that single view of our customer. We want to have, consistent and accurate reports and dashboards, actionable information that informs our business decisions, gain that competitive advantage, and we want to base it all on data. Well, if we're going to do all of that, if we're going to be data-driven, we need to manage that data. Right, Hugo, you mentioned data as an asset. Well, if data will be an asset, it needs to be managed for sure. So data management is that business function of planning for, controlling, and delivering data and information assets. And this is according to DAMA, the Data Management Association International. So that's high-level overview. And data management really has a lot of different pieces that you can tackle. The metadata management, data quality management, data architecture, data modeling, data storage, data warehousing, business intelligence, reference data, master data management. There's all these different pieces. And one of them really is also data governance. Why? Because, well, if we're going to get all of that, if we're going to become data-driven, we need to make sure that we're going to have, clean data, documented data, it's categorized, it's classified, and so on. And to do that, we need some policies in place. If we're going to know what steps we need to follow to clean it, to clean the data, to make it consistent, to, provide access to the right people at the right time, in the right place, to secure it, to define it, we need to follow some processes. And again, from some of the examples that Miguel provided, we also need some consistency. We need some oversight in our cleanliness definitions and so on. So we need to follow some standards so that we all use the same date format. And of course, we need to understand who's going to do all of this. What are all these people in their different roles? So those roles and responsibilities need to be defined. And all of this is what data governance is really covering. It's that exercise of authority, controlled, and shared decision-making over, the management of all these data assets.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation, and thank you very much, George, for sharing that, because I think one of the areas of confusion, right, and in a topics that is complex or could be complex for many people, is really understanding those distinctions and how understanding those distinctions to implement the right measures within your organization, right? So how do we start? Do we start by doing some tactical stuff? Do we start by doing a more strategic approach first, and then defining what's the roadmap for the future actions in the context of a data management or data governance program? So super important, clarifying that distinction, and thank you very much for providing that framework.
One of my
Yes.
I was just going to give an analogy that I've heard from one of my students, actually, who was kind of trying to explain for himself and in his own, reference. And he was saying that data management is kind of the game and the activities, and data governance is kind of the game rules. Data governance board can be the referee and so forth and so on. So I don't know if this, hits a goal with anybody.
Yeah, no, 100%.
No, and it makes it even simpler and clear, that example. One just small comment using George definition is, George mentioned that, for example, data management and governance is a business function, because we normally hear a lot, data quality, integration, data warehouse, that normally are IT functions. And then I see when George defined, all of this topic as a business function, it is not only IT involvement what is required to be successful. And especially sometimes people say, oh, data quality is an IT responsibility, or put some rules that I don't put some IT check-ins that I don't input data wrong, and that is not the case. It's a business function, like when we want to, as you mentioned, Hugo, if you want to have an asset, you measure, like the measurement of the return over that asset is not an IT responsibility. The same should happen with the data. It's business responsibility that we need if we want to treat data as an asset. The return of the value of the data is also a business responsibility. And then, of course, it has a lot of IT involvements and activities, but it should be driven by the business as well. I would say like one of the key aspects, if you want to be successful, this needs to be driven by business, not only IT. And I think, describing this as a business function, it makes it more clear. And I think that is great from the George definition that he provides.
No, that's awesome, and that's a great segue into sort of question number 3, because let's assume I am the VP of supply chain and a manufacturing company, and I listen to this podcast or discussion, and I feel like we got something to do in our organization. We have to do something about data management in the supply chain field. I feel excited about the opportunity. I want to move forward. Now, what are the resources that are required to start a data governance or data management program, right? So what are at least the resources or minimum resources that you should consider to start with this? Right. So some people within my team. Should I define, a responsible person within my team? What's my role? So let's try to discuss a little bit more about that.
I think it depends on the scope of the program and how much you wanna bite first, how big that bite should be. But at the very minimum, you need some sort of a data governance lead, and you can call them in different ways. A lot of times they're sort of promoted from within. So maybe they're a business analyst, or they might even be a manager of a particular unit that are really treading the line between data and business as well. So they understand both sides, because it's good for this one individual to understand the technical side, but also the business side in terms of the lingo, the language, but priorities as well, and requirements, and have an understanding of limitations of both, so they can drive the discussions forward and come up with those best practices and see what works for their own environment. So again, you do need that data governance lead, but they're not going to come up with, hey, these are the priorities that I'm going to put in front of you. We need the business side to tell us when things need to be done, what should be prioritized, because there's a lot out there that we can tackle. So we need some sort of a group formed by business leaders, and usually these are the heads of all these departments, maybe one from like the research department, the supply chain department, the production department, the marketing and sales, and so forth and so on, and come to a consensus as part of a data governance council, I call it, but it has different names too, and decide the priorities for the data governance program. What should be tackled first? And of course, the data governance lead would have that influence and direction and everything, and guide them. But it's the business that needs to make that decision. And of course, it's not just a one-person show. You can't just have the data governance lead do everything. They need to have support. So a lot of times they work with the business leaders and their own designates, and those designates tend to become data stewards. So again, they're experts that are working with this data on a day-to-day basis, either because they input it a lot, or they analyze it, or they're taking care of it in their Excel spreadsheets. But they care and they understand that importance. They're just not doing it properly, following those best practices. So working with the data governance lead or data governance office, they're going to start following those best practices and making sure that others will too. To be fair, I think it's, again, a big bite to take from the first. So a lot of companies work with, external partners such as the OWL solutions, which is perfectly fine to get things started and do an as-is analysis, see what the status is, implement some best practices there. And what I also like by having a third party involved is that they're not biased. They come, completely no agenda. They're not used to all the different as-is situation, the different processes. It's all a blank slate, and they're really looking at this with an independent lens. And they're able to see gaps where internally you might miss them. So at the very bare minimum, you need to have that lead. Probably you're going to work with some business leaders to form that data governance council and then create those data stewards internal. And of course, you need to have the sponsor at a high level. You need somebody to sponsor this, support this, promote this, fund it.
Yeah, I think George explained it all, but one small comment regarding the stewards.
Yes.
It could be, like based on videos that George has, you could have centralized stewards, people that say, oh, if we want to create a customer record, there is only one person that does it. Or you could have decentralized stewards that say, as a part of your job, you have responsibility to of some portion of the data. There are different approaches. Both of them could have pros and cons. And I will say, and this is my opinion, but I would say centralized stewards work really well for master data because you don't create it really often. In the case of the supply chain, you don't put 100 vendors every single day. You need to do a process, gathering information, but it's not that we create 100 or 1,000 vendors every single day. And then having a centralized steward that analyzes which data we need to complete for that record is feasible. But for transactional data, an organization could put, 1,000 POs a day, every PO with 10 lines, and then we are talking about 10,000 records that we should, monitor. And then centralized approach for transactional data, it could be done, but it requires a lot of effort. And then the responsibility, my take on how we define stewards is, I think, especially for transactional data within the supply chain, should be, in this case, the responsibility of the buyer when they issue a PO, because we could issue a lot of PO. That doesn't mean that we don't put, control mechanisms after the fact or before the fact to help them, but the responsibility probably is better if it's decentralized. But as I say, it depends on how many resources. If you have resources for centralized resources to put, a data governance analyst for creating vendors and customers, I would say that is also good because you have resources that could be doing not only that activity. It depends of how many resources, but my advice is like for transactional data where we see a lot of problems, it could be an extension of the responsibility of the people that they are executing the transaction. But they need support, as George mentioned. They don't know the best practices. They don't know what would be the impact. And then they need this external, picture or perspective that tell them, this is what you should be completing. This is the format that you should be doing. And that is the reason, help from outside is also valuable. But it depends on the each organization. But I will say, understanding, if you put 1,000 POs a day, there is no way that you could have it centralize it. But if you put 10, why not? That there is one person that put the POs and we make sure that the information get completed properly.
Miguel, I wonder if from your experience in the supply chain, you've also seen issues besides issues with transactional data and not managing that properly, but also with reference data. So reference data being data that's kind of used to classify or categorize other types of data, transaction data, master data in general. So things like, let's say, units of measurements or country codes or corporate codes, types of products, the size of the T-shirt, things like that.
Yeah, no, I would say that there is a couple of examples that we could bring. Let's start with, for example, something big that even though we use it in every single day transaction, doesn't get completed. The vendors, like the suppliers that you have, because it could be, that you have, they sometimes create every shipping location from your company. It become a different vendor for you. And then from a system perspective, they have two records, but actually legally it's the same one. And then when you want to analyze, for example, spend, you don't see the aggregation of what is the relevant vendor. You could have distortion that, this vendor is not, spending a lot, but because they have 3 or 4 records of the same vendor, one of them for each location. And then having vendor consolidation or vendor harmonization is extremely important to have good procurement analytics. And then that is a topic, for example, within vendors that is extremely important for a master data perspective. Another example that is really that happen a lot is unit of measures. Especially in supply chain, you could manage multiple unit of measures. And sometimes the information, how you buy things, you could buy things, especially because here in Canada, you are really close to the States, and then everything there is in pounds, and here everything is in kilos. And then you buy in pounds, you receive in kilos, and that, if it's not managed properly, your transactions, or if there is no governance in terms of if I review the inventory, and if I see inventory data, the inventory data, because it's in Canada, probably will be in kilos. And you see, I have 1,000 units in kilos. But if I buy 1,000, it doesn't mean that you buy 1,000 kilos. You buy probably 1,000 pounds, especially if you buy them in the States. And then it's not that master data is not important in supply chain. It's extremely important. But also you have problem with transactional data that people don't give the importance because they see that it's straightforward. That is, like they see order date. How could you have a confusion, or receive date, and or other aspects of the transactional data? But master data is also important in supply chain. The 2 examples I gave is we could give more, but you need good master data to reflect what happened in your physical supply chains, and you have examples across all the departments or division of a company.
That's excellent. Now, the good news, I think, is that there's a solution for what we're describing, and I think again, one of the good news is that we at the OWL were approaching this problem by helping organizations to address 3 key issues. Number 1 is hopefully helping organizations to structure a stronger data foundation first. Second, helping those organizations to integrate different data sources, because that's traditionally a challenge in the environment of multi-system, multi-sourcing software. And third, then once you have that data foundation, once you have been able to integrate some of those data sources, now having the analytical layer to start turning that data into something that is meaningful and insightful for the decision maker. And we believe that that's a recipe that at the end covers elements that allow the supply chain professional to move the supply chain performance forward. And that's sort of the recipe that we're implementing with our customers. And we sort of invite everyone interested to explore this new approach. Basically, connect with us for an initial call that is going to help those professionals to get immediate access to insights and ideas on how to improve the performance moving forward. At the end, well, thank you very much, George and Miguel, for being with us today. It's been a great discussion. I really enjoyed it personally. I think I learned a lot too, and so thank you also, to our audience for watching this video. And don't forget to download your procurement data template to start planning today and improving the quality of that data. Be sure to check our social media as well, social media channels, for more supply chain content. And again, if you want to start utilizing better concepts around data governance today, so book a call with us to see if it is a good fit for you. So thank you very much, George. Any final words at the end?
Keep the lights on data, and thank you for having me as part of the conversation.
Awesome. Miguel?
No, it was a pleasure, and it's always good to have someone with the experience that George has to talk about this topic and how they are relevant for the supply chain professionals.
Oh, likewise.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.